Before the bustle of breakfast, before the coal fires were coaxed into submission and teapots started their quiet symphony of steam, there came the sacred, bumbling ritual of getting dressed in the Victorian era. Now, getting dressed might sound like an activity one might complete in under 5 minutes today. Reach for a sweater, step into some trousers, possibly consider socks if one is feeling ambitious. But in the 1800s, this daily routine was less of an outfit change and more of a full-body negotiation with layers, laces, and the laws of physics. Let us begin with the wealthy, because if dressing like a lasagna of linen and wool sounds inconvenient, imagine being rich enough to outsource your suffering. For the upper-class Victorian lady, the first step of the day was not opening her eyes, but rather being gently awakened by a maid, preferably one who already had the tea tray prepared and was immune to sarcasm delivered pre-coffee. Then came the business of the corset, also known as the most elaborate method of internal organ rearrangement, known before modern surgery. The corset wasn't merely an accessory, it was the scaffolding upon which the rest of the outfit precariously depended. Tightly laced by hand, often while the wearer held onto a sturdy bedpost or mild sense of regret, the goal was a waist that could comfortably accommodate only about 1.5 scones. It was not just about fashion, but about morality. A neatly cinched waist meant you had discipline, much like demonstrating your piety by politely refusing gin before 11 a.m. Once the corset had completed its gentle impression of a boa constrictor, the layers began. First came a chemise, a soft, loose undergarment meant to absorb sweat and preserve all the expensive layers that came next, because hygiene, while wildly misunderstood, still understood not ruining petticoats. After the chemise, a progression of petticoats descended, some stiffened with horsehair, others with crinoline, many of them determined to catch on every piece of furniture within a 2-mile radius. These petticoats were not simply for volume. They were Victorian airbags, designed to buoy you gracefully through crowds and trap the occasional child attempting to play under your skirts, which was, as documented, an actual problem. Then came the corseted bodice, often sewn with more tiny hooks than a pirate-themed fishing convention. And finally, the outer gown, constructed from yards of fabric that rustled, swooshed, and whispered gossip behind your back. And shoes, please. They were tiny, sparkly torture devices, barely a notch above medieval hoofwear. Unlike today, where shoes are sometimes chosen for walking, Victorian shoes often prioritized looking decorative while reminding the wearer with every step that beauty is pain and blisters. Let's not forget accessories, gloves, hats the size of small cartwheels, parasols, the polite umbrella with superiority, complex, chatelaines. Think of those as the Swiss Army knives of respectable womanhood, jingling with tiny sewing scissors, vinaigrettes, and keys to curious locked things husbands weren't supposed to ask about. For a man, one might think it was easier, and it was, marginally. But they too had their own ridiculous checklist. Morning dress began with a linen shirt so stiff it could double as a small canoe, then drawers, braces, waistcoat, cravat, tailcoat, and trousers so tightly tailored they required choreography. Hair was slicked, moustaches waxed into emotional punctuation marks. Hats were compulsory, toppers tall enough to signal storm weather. And beneath the clothing, the silence. Because no one discussed how uncomfortable it all was. Suffering, fashionably, was as essential as tea or empire. It's important to note that servants had their own ordeal. Most wore uniforms, often without stays or complex layers, but hardship came in another form. Getting up at 4 a.m. to help Lady Winifred shove her legs into boots made for someone half her shoe size. Getting dressed in the Victorian era was not just a personal activity, it was a communal enterprise involving collaboration, architecture, and sometimes the emotional support of a distant cousin. But perhaps there's something to admire here. Beneath the corsets and starch, the real strength of the Victorians was their sheer daily commitment to complexity. They believed quite profoundly, that order on the outside led to order within. And if that meant wearing 12 petticoats in July and passing out at tea, then by Jove, so be it. And as our candle of curiosity gently flickers out, remember, the next time you put on yoga pants and call it a day, you're not lazy. You're historically evolved. If these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time Silks it is there. Now rest easy, for tomorrow holds another layer worth unbuttoning. In the pre-electric hush of a Victorian dawn, the house stirred before its people did. Coal in the kitchen hearth exhaled its first sooty breath, and somewhere upstairs, a maid named Dorothy was already elbow-deep in the fiery and unspoken terror that was goose-fat soap. She eased the heavy bedroom curtains ajar, letting in a sliver of England's greyest light. Hardly enough to read a thermometer by, but just enough to let your body mourn its own existence in the cold. A lady's toilette, you see, was less of a morning routine and more of a slow, strategic campaign against gravity, bodily odor, and unacceptable ankles. To prepare oneself for public decency, one did not simply wake up and get dressed. One arose like a tragicomic phoenix from the smothering ash of 14 layers of linen. First came the chemise, pronounced chemise, as if even the word is embarrassed to be there. This was a simple, shapeless thing made of cotton or linen worn directly against the skin. Its purpose was not style, self-expression, or even dignity, but rather to take the full brunt of your body's commitment to being a mammal. Under modern scrutiny, the chemise defends itself nobly. "Don't judge me," it might say. "I am the only thing standing between you and daily corset laundering." Next up were the drawers, open-crotched ones in fact, because believe it or not, the Victorians were very invested in keeping bathroom visits as unintimate as possible. The more barriers between you and the chamber pot, the less flirtation with scandal. These were tied at the waist, usually stiff, certainly itchy, and always made out of a fabric that said, "I ruin dreams." Then came the stays, or corset if you're feeling dramatic. And one usually was. Though not the rib-snapping Iron Maiden often envisioned, the Victorian stay was no picnic. Your ribcage was invited to a compression, party it never RSVP'd to. Whalebone and later steel would coax your body into whatever shape fashion dictated that decade. Wasp-waisted, pigeon-breasted, or barrel-bodied, each one a unique way to reconsider breakfast. The corset was tightened gradually, with a bit of prayer, a bit of sweat, and, ideally, a servant who had both upper body strength and no empathy. If you're keeping count, we're only 3 or 4 layers deep, and our Victorian lady isn't even respectably visible yet. After the corset, a cotton petticoat was added, for warmth, volume, and modesty. Then perhaps another. Then definitely another. How many? As many as would keep the wind from alerting London to the shape of your knees. Depending on the year, one might don a crinoline as well, a vast, cage-like contraption designed to make you look like you had the circumference of a hot air balloon with none of the conveniences. Though glorious in spin potential, these were not great for small staircases, crowded carriages, or standing too close to open fires. Losses were not unheard of. Then came the bodice, a kind of fitted jacket in which one could neither exhale nor express discomfort, followed by the skirt, which was secured with hooks, buttons, and a general sense of betrayal. It had the weight and attitude of a resentful cat. Accessories came next. An embroidered fichu or chemisette covered one scandalous neckline, so that no one would see the faint suggestion of clavicle, and immediately demand your hand in marriage. Gloves became essentially compulsory, because touching things was clearly immoral. And the hair. Ah, the hair. Pinned, twisted, stuffed, coiled. held together with such industrial determination that if you tripped and fell, at least your bun would survive. By this point, any thought of breakfast had been physically squeezed from your consciousness. Who could eat when one's liver had been relocated to a Victorian purse somewhere to the left of your sternum? And still, you weren't done. Before you met the public, you required boots with 32 buttons per shoe, a modest bonnet, the more it resembled an upholstered soup bowl, the better, a reticule resembling a doily with trust issues, a parasol, and the stamina to faint gently but convincingly. Getting dressed, then, wasn't a chore. It was a full-scale battle, a performance in 17 acts, with your own body as both the stage and the antagonist. And just when she was finally, miraculously, buttoned, pinned, and cinched into readiness, Our Lady realized what all proper Victorian women eventually did. She had to use the loo. Slip off your shoes for now, dear listener. There's more dreamlike absurdity to come as we wander further into the most buttoned-up era in history. Imagine it's 1865, and you've just opened your eyes to the dull glow of a misty English morning. The house is cold enough to make your breath visible. The chamber pot is judging you silently from across the room, and you are expected, with no hint of sarcasm, to greet the day beautifully dressed by at least 9 a.m., lest you be mistaken for some kind of social anarchist. There is no such thing as throwing on whatever's clean and vaguely acceptable. No, you are a Victorian. Your clothes are a declaration of morality, social rank, and your mother's most fervent prayers. You cannot be seen without first donning an entire architectural project that makes getting ready feel less like casual dressing and more like domestic construction. Let's begin with the chemise. This is your base layer, your first defense against the scratchy woolen menace of everything else to come. It is a linen shift, plain, modest, and nearly shapeless, which is precisely how Victorians liked most things, unless they were lace-trimmed or repressively tight. Over this, you add drawers, or as they were charmingly known before elastic was a thing, open-crotched pantalettes. Yes, you heard that. Right. Keep in mind these were worn not for modesty, but for, shall we say, ventilation and easy access when nature in full corset came calling. Charming. Next comes the corset, the star of every Victorian morning emotional breakdown. Designed to sculpt the body according to ideals that assumed women to be both sturdy fence posts and prone to fainting, the corset was the mammoth hurdle of dressing. Getting laced was a team sport. Ideally, you'd have a patient maid or a sister who owed you at least 3 favors and a secret kept. You'd stand, arms braced, gripping the bedpost like you were being recruited into the Navy against your will, as the corset was yanked tighter and tighter until your waist resembled that of a startled hummingbird. Now, before you adjust that mental image, remember, they called it tight lacing, not moderate lacing. Lungs shrank, ribs reconfigured. Doctors made concerned noises. But heaven forbid a woman breathe too freely when she could be a perfect hourglass instead. If you survived the corset, you'd move on to the crinoline, essentially a massive hoop skirt made of steel or horsehair, sometimes both, which surrounded your lower half with an aggressively circular personality. The crinoline turned every woman into a walking bell tower, and navigating narrow Victorian doorways or lingering near open flames became a hazard that was both comedic and, shockingly often, fatal. Crinolines had a bad habit of catching fire, flipping up unexpectedly, or trapping small pets. It was like wearing a circus tent with a grudge. Over the crinoline, you'd finally layer on your petticoats, often multiple, because one was simply not enough suffering. Petticoats added weight, volume, and a sort of swishing resonance that let everyone know you were coming at least 30 seconds before you appeared in any room. Somewhere underneath all this, your actual body still existed, but it had long since given up voting rights in morning decisions. By this point, you're about 45 minutes into dressing, you haven't had breakfast, and your arm strength is waning. Time to put on your gown, a marvel of tailoring, padding, pleats, buttons, hooks, and delicate embroidery sewn by tiny, soon-to-be blind child workers in a factory lit by candlelight. The dress itself might weigh 12 pounds and require a complex system of interior fastenings, many of which are designed by people who clearly hated the concept of free time. Then the final touches: stockings held up by garters, ankle boots, gloves that mysteriously always feel too small, and a bonnet designed to suggest you are both fashionable and incapable of peripheral vision. Of course, your hair isn't yet done. That's another waking hour, and a future ordeal all its own. But dressing wasn't just about attire. It was about presenting one's moral fiber, a literal and metaphorical tightness. Victorians believed that a well-dressed person, corseted, polished, perched rigidly in a sea of skirt, was a person who could be trusted. And if you fainted strategically, even better, it meant you were delicate, pure, and unbothered by indulgences such as oxygen. As the layers settle upon you like the weight of social expectation, you teeter downstairs for the day's most anticipated event, breakfast, and the chance to sit absolutely still for 5 blessed minutes. But before that bite of toast can even reach your lips, a new question unfurls like a lace parasol. How exactly, one wonders, did Victorian hair become its own gravity-defying spectacle? But that, of course, is another tale entirely. The crack of dawn filtered shyly through lace-trimmed curtains, casting polite beams of light onto the rug. A rug, let's be clear, that had absorbed more molten candle wax and boot polish crumbs than most Victorian autobiographers were willing to admit. And thus, our subject awoke. Or rather, was awoken by the delicate orchestration of noises unique to a well-staged Victorian morning. The clang of the coal scuttle, the gently accusatory brush of a maid's skirts, and somewhere outside, the mildly disgruntled whinny of a horse who'd been given lukewarm oats. In the grand theatre of Victorian dressing, one did not simply leap out of bed and toss on yesterday's trousers. Oh no, that would be uncivilized and possibly scandalous. First, one had to properly rise. Gentlefolk required an intermediate state between sleep and full consciousness, a kind of pre-dawning laziness in which one sat in bed, posed elegantly like a moderately bewitched wax figure, while being assisted into a series of garments of increasing restrictiveness. Waking up was a team sport. A lady might greet her day in a long nightdress, ruffled like a meringue, and ambiguously scented of lavender water and last night's cough lozenge. Over this would grace the wrapper, a kind of housecoat designed to preserve modesty in the unlikely and horrific event that one should be spotted by a household servant before one's corset had cinched its first whimper. And let us speak now of the corset. Ah, the corset, lovingly referred to by 19th century garment merchants as the pillar of posture, and by ribs as our long, slow undoing. A complex affair of whalebone, lacing, and sheer stubbornness, the corset was not a single garment, but a daily declaration of social standing, feminine virtue, and respiratory compromise. Now, it is worth noting that not every Victorian woman laced herself into a wasp-like silhouette early in the morning. Some women, particularly those less inclined toward fainting at the sight of jam, wore more relaxed stays. But for those aspiring to high fashion, or simply high society, tight lacing was deemed essential. Doctors, of course, tut-tutted with great gravitas. The medical establishment issued frowny pamphlets on subjects like corset liver and mechanical hysteria, which did absolutely nothing to slow the trend, because nothing says fashionable like endangering the functionality of vital organs. Back in our modest bedroom, the lady inhaled as deeply as the moment permitted, and here, deeply meant roughly the lung capacity of an optimistic finch. Her maid, wielding a corset's laces like a ship captain adjusting rigging, performed a well-rehearsed tug and winch routine. "Is it too tight, ma'am?" the maid might delicately inquire, as the lady turned a polite shade of Victorian blue, which science has since classified as halfway between denim and mild oxygen deprivation. "Not at all," she'd reply, airily, as stars played in her periphery and 3 of her ribs started writing complaint letters to Parliament. Over this structured exoskeleton went the chemise, already in place. Petticoats, each one fluffy, weighty, and ambitious in its circumference. And then the crinoline. Oh yes, the crinoline, an architectural marvel, a cage of steel hoops that expanded the skirt outward in glorious bell-like defiance, rendering narrow doorways obstructive and chairs a daring gamble. Stepping into a crinoline was rather like stepping into a philosophical decision about gravity. Women learned to glide rather than walk, as if propelled inwardly by poetic sighs and expensive foot powder. And now, the overdress, the final vessel of the morning's voyage, made of layered silk, wool, or if one was feeling particularly wealthy and seasonably incorrect, velvet. It buttoned at the back, which of course meant only 2 types of people could successfully wear it, those with a lady's maid and Victorian circus contortionists. As buttons were fastened with meditative patience, the final finishing touches emerged. Stockings were rolled neatly above the knee and secured with garters. Shoes, buttoned, laced, or horrifyingly narrow, slid on with the help of a shoehorn the size of a fencing foil. And if the household had truly risen in fortune, a little pomade might decorate the hair, parting it in that perfectly severe middle line required by the aesthetic laws set forth by Queen Victoria and every illustration in Godey's Lady's Book. At last, she was dressed, or at least moderately battle-ready. A light sheen of fatigue clung to her temples, which she dabbed with a lavender-scented handkerchief. Breakfast awaited downstairs, somewhere past 5 staircases, and the judgmental gaze of a grandfather clock. And while it had taken nearly an hour, 3 petticoats, a minor reduction in lung capacity, and a mercifully kind-hearted maid, she was finally beginning to look, well, Victorian. And so, with layers rustling like the pages of a novel never quite finished, she made her stately way toward the tea urn, unaware that someone, somewhere, was designing an undergarment twice as complicated and half as breathable. Next came the part of the Victorian dressing ritual that truly separated the minorly inconvenienced from the monumentally uncomfortable: corsets. Ah yes, those famous instruments of fashionable constraint, known to support posture, reshape figures, and gently rearrange your internal organs like a polite but firm Victorian aunt, reorganizing your desk drawers without asking. Now, to be fair, and fairness is key, even when talking about being laced into a breath-restricting bodice, corsets weren't necessarily evil. In fact, many women felt more confidently lifted and well-arranged whilst wearing one, much like a carefully alphabetized bookshelf. But that experience only applied if your corset was thoughtfully crafted, properly fit, and, crucially, not tightened by a well-meaning maid with the biceps of a longshoreman and the ambition of a boa constrictor. A well-tailored corset of the mid-1800s might take 10 to 15 minutes to put on properly. First came the chemise, an underlayer to protect the corset from your skin, and your skin from the corset. Modesty, after all, had to be preserved, even when gasping for air. Then came the corset itself, which, with its whalebone supports and steel boning, yes, steel, resembled nothing so much as a gentle embrace from an octopus made entirely of fencing equipment. Lacing was both an art and a science. If tightened incorrectly, too high, too low, too haphazardly, it could cause everything from acid reflux to philosophical despair. Victorian medical texts warned against the perils of tight lacing, citing real or imagined maladies like fainting, organ displacement, and an inability to enjoy soup. Soup took deep, unguarded breaths. You see the problem. Still, a fashionable silhouette was a prize worth contorting for. The ideal involved a narrow waist, 18 to 22 inches, aspirationally, framed by a rounded bosom and full hips. This created the so-called wasp waist, a term which sounds adorable until you remember that actual wasps are known for their stingers and existential fury. But corsets were not the only structure in this wonderland of wardrobe engineering. Oh no. Once you were properly cinched within your rib squeeze rectangle, you moved on to the next layer, the crinoline, a word that sounds delicate and graceful, but functioned more like a wearable trampoline. Crinolines were voluminous, petticoat-like cages, originally made with horsehair and linen, a combo that sounds like it ought to be galloping, then later fashioned with steel hoops. These hoops expanded a woman's skirts outward by several feet on either side, giving her a stately, bell-shaped silhouette that was both beautiful and wildly inconvenient when passing through doorways, sitting in carriages, or attempting human conversation. Imagine walking around all day with a collapsible patio umbrella strapped to your waist, and you'll begin to understand. It wasn't unusual for ladies to knock over teacups, vases, small pets, and occasionally entire footstools with a single unexpected pivot. Now, wearing a corset and a crinoline at the same time was a commitment. You couldn't really reach your feet, so socks and shoes had to be applied by others, or in carefully executed prayer position crouches. Staircases posed dangers. Water closets were experimental. The sighs heard throughout the Victorian home were not always of longing or romance, but of gravity-defying garments and the crushing reality of geometry. And yet, despite the discomfort and logistical chaos, crinolines did offer an unexpected delight. They lifted the heavy layers of outer skirts away from the body, creating a delightful breeze and, perhaps most shocking, a little ventilation. In a world before deodorant and reliable plumbing, this was no small mercy. Some women reported the joy of feeling air currents swirling in mysterious and uplifting ways beneath their skirts as they walked, a whimsical consolation prize for dragging a minor architectural feature behind you at all times. Corsets and crinolines together formed the foundation, quite literally, of every fashionable Victorian outfit. They reshaped the body into a living hourglass, a confection of curves and posture, elegance and constraint. But before we pile on the moral judgments, let us remember, we still wear shoes that hurt and jeans that lie about their stretch. As the morning sun climbed higher over the coal-smudged rooftops of 1860s London, our well-dressed heroine, corset squeezed, crinoline assembled, was finally halfway ready for the day. All it took was iron hardware, restricted oxygen, and the spatial awareness of a professional fencer. And with underpinnings secured, it was time at last to move to the next layer, the bustle of bustle, the part of fashion history where things got oddly fluffy and suspiciously sculptural. As dawn crept politely over foggy Victorian rooftops, the housemaid was often already in motion, creeping less politely down drafty corridors in half-laced boots. You see, in the intricate multi-sensory ballet that was Victorian dressing, the first act did not star the lady or the lord of the house. It starred the maid. Usually bleary-eyed, sometimes frozen, almost always clutching a warming pan like it was a life raft for her hands. Before the first breath of coal smoke curled from the parlour chimneys, she would have tiptoed to the lady's bedroom, stirred the banked fire back to life, and perhaps warmed her mistress's undergarments slightly by the flickering hearth, because nothing says morning luxury quite like stepping into toasty linen while still drowsy with dreams of eligible viscounts and unsolicited fainting spells. Now, preparing a Victorian lady for the day was not unlike assembling a decorative layer cake, except with more whalebone and moral judgment. And funnily enough, it was the lowest and least visible layers that required the most philosophizing in the dark. First, the chemise, a plain shift, soft and serviceable, the Switzerland of undergarments. Completely neutral, though usually a bit riddled with discreet embroidery, because modesty was one thing, but neglecting floral needlework on your underlayers, well, that was just savage. Then came the drawers, a slightly misleading term, since Victorian drawers often didn't meet in the middle. They were split, shall we say, for convenience. And yes, that convenience was exactly the sort you're currently imagining. Historians still debate whether the design was made for hygiene, speed of access, or just sheer delight in baffling future museum docents. Following that peculiar little innovation came the corset. Ah, the corset. The garment-cum-torture device that made every meal an act of mild rebellion and every breath a small, elegant struggle. Laced in the back, tightened by an understanding maid or a deeply unsympathetic aunt, the corset claimed to support posture, bolster morality, and reduce the silhouette to wandering ghost in a polite fever dream. It did not, however, allow its wearer to bend at the waist, sneeze freely, or digest in under 6 hours. Once the corset was in place, and once the weeping quietly subsided, it was time for structural reinforcement in the form of the crinoline, or later the bustle. You might think Victorians wore cages for privation or penitence, but no. These elaborate contraptions of sprung steel or horsehair were designed to hold up acres of skirt, providing both the coveted bell shape and the ability to accidentally knock over side tables just by turning slightly to the left. The petticoats came next. Not one, not two, but sometimes up to 5, depending on the season, the social occasion, and how many battles your hips were willing to fight that day. Flounced, ruffled, sometimes even quilted, they swished and rustled with each demure tread, like a scandal attempting to sneak through the drawing room. By this point, the upper limbs desired some shelter too. Corset cover might be added. Think of it as a gentle little blouse, whose only mission was to shield the corset from public attention and potential accusations of being altogether too French. Sleeves of lace, tucks, and mother-of-pearl buttons soon followed, each sewn with the dainty fury of a woman trying to keep her wrists decorous and her family name unsullied. Now, fully encased in cotton, whalebone, steel, and patience, came the pièce de résistance, the dress. Layers of silk or wool, buttons the unfortunate length of a Lovecraftian novella, and, if one was particularly blessed or cursed, additional embellishments such as fringe, piping, or an applique of swans. Donning this outer layer might require the full upper body strength of your most durable maid. If it involved hooks and eyes, and it always did, then prepare for 30 minutes of blind fumbling and mutual sighing. And oh, we mustn't forget the fichu, a whispery, decorative scarf arranged with studied nonchalance around the neck and bosom, as if one had accidentally fluttered through a handkerchief department and emerged with virtue intact. Add shoes, gloves, a brooch, and perhaps a feathered hat so large it required aerodynamic calculation, and Madame was finally ready for breakfast, or at least for reclining like a wounded swan on the chaise lounge while the maid applied smelling salts to whoever forgot to dust the antimacassars. So dressing was complete, for now. Not comfortable, and certainly not simple. But grand. Always grand. Next, we'll tiptoe into the curious world of men's morning routines, no less elaborate and arguably more starched, as the morning sun filtered through tall, lace-adorned windows, hovering somewhere between a gentle glow and divine intervention. Our Victorian subject, still only half-dressed and a full hour into the ordeal, would prepare for the next installment of their sartorial saga. Sleeves. Yes, the sleeves. Those immortal, puffed, ruffled, ruched, and occasionally aggressive appendages that turned a woman's arms into elegant battering rams of fashion. You see, the Victorian sleeve was not so much an article of clothing as it was a statement of purpose. In the earlier decades of the 19th century, sleeves were enormous, ballooning outwards like hot air balloons mid-launch. One could clear a party room doorway just by turning around with enough flourish. These were known as gigot sleeves, or more charmingly, leg of mutton sleeves. Any resemblance to actual lamb limbs was, we assure you, gloriously intentional. To get them to stand so valiantly upright, several architectural feats were required. Starch, padding, and sometimes even internal wiring helped the sleeves retain their glorious silhouette. Can you imagine, dear listener, lacing up your corset, wriggling into your petticoat fortress, and then needing help to insert both arms into inflatable arm sausages while maintaining the delicate composure of a lady who definitely isn't choking on her own cuff? Naturally, once Her Highness had wrangled herself into her sleeves, what followed was the buttoning process, a test of loyalty and finger dexterity for at least one loyal lady's maid. The Victorian blouse did not believe in convenience. Rows of buttons, sometimes over 30 per garment, needed to be fiddled through with dainty fervor, often located up the back where neither the wearer nor common sense could reach. This intimate daily ritual bonded many upper-class women with their maids in ways that would be considered uncomfortably up close by modern workstation safety regulations. Now, while the upper classes were staging fabric operas on their arms, the working-class Victorian folk were opting for practicality, though still under the watchful eye of societal judgment. Their sleeves were more modest, often detachable for laundering purposes, and blessedly less filled with emotional baggage. However, even they weren't entirely immune to fashion's slow, ridiculous march. A laundress might still struggle with corset stays poking at her sides while scrubbing a chamber pot, because dignity takes effort, even in the humbler dwellings. And so, sleeved and slightly sore, our Victorian fashion explorer would move toward the next consideration: lace. If lace were a person, it'd be the very busy, slightly dramatic cousin who arrives early to your birthday party with trifles of something frothy and impractical. Lace yearned to be everywhere: collars, cuffs, chemisettes, undersleeves, and sometimes entire parasols. The making of lace was, in itself, a slow and ancient form of time travel. Whether handmade or acquired from the lacy wonders of Belgium, because of course lace had provenance, this delicately looped thread was less a trim and more a statement of taste, class, and willingness to have your laundry take 17 hours. Let us not underestimate the difficulty of donning these layers while staying perfectly composed. One had to sit just so, move like a feather wafting down a marble staircase, and never perspire. Perspiration was considered unseemly, and the antidote was scent: layers of perfume strong enough to stun a mid-sized deer. Lavender water, rose oil, and violet pomade were slapped on with dainty abandon, making every Victorian dinner party smell like an overstimulated greenhouse. And that, dear listener, is how a single woman's sleeves could threaten the structural integrity of both social hierarchies and dinnerware. But before we begin discussing the even more dramatic matter of skirts, yes, the ones capable of achieving their own orbits, let us rest here, suspended in this moment of muslin and lavender, the scent of starch still lingering in the air. Somewhere between the early morning fog and the second cruel tightening of one's corset cords, Victorian ladies were expected to achieve what we might call respectable visibility. This meant being public ready in both appearance and demeanor by roughly 11 a.m., or earlier if receiving visitors. The tricky part was that getting dressed, styled, and emotionally recalibrated to face the world took approximately the same amount of time a modern person might spend preparing for international travel. At the heart of this sluggish sartorial ritual was hairstyling, not to be underestimated. A woman's hair, her crowning glory, as magazines of the time repeatedly cooed, wasn't merely an accessory. It was a billboard for health, femininity, and emotional stability. Hence, it had to be brushed until it could reflect small thoughts, styled with architectural precision, and secured with enough pins to mildly alarm local compasses. Hairbrushing was a cornerstone, a daily, meditative, and mildly exhausting process involving approximately 100 strokes. Yes, 100. Such commitment could summon either a radiant sheen or a shoulder cramp, depending on technique. Brushes were often made of boar bristle because, of course, why not start your day with a ritual involving a pig? Now, for women of means, There was a solution to the complexity of hair. Someone else did it. The lady's maid was a silent hero in the great Victorian production of femininity. A backstage technician with nimble fingers, endless patience, and a working knowledge of complicated knotwork, she could navigate complex braids, curls cascading like polite waterfalls, and coiled buns that looked deceptively casual but were, in fact, full of structural engineering. Think less messy bun and more Gothic cathedral. Hair powder had conveniently fallen out of style by the Victorian era, sparing many lungs a tasteless end. However, hair oils and homemade tonics graced the scene. Some blends included ingredients meant to improve texture, such as castor oil, rosemary tincture, or, more questionably, onion juice. Yes, because nothing attracts a suitor like the faint aroma of a tapas bar. Marketing for these products promised not merely improved scalp health, but marital happiness, which shows you just how potent advertising was even before the internet. Wigs were less commonly worn by respectable women, though hairpieces and switches, lengths of hair woven to supplement one's natural locks, were very much in vogue. On particularly ambitious hair days, a lady might insert several of these hairpieces into her own tresses, creating volume that whispered, "I've never done a day of manual labor," and sometimes shouted, "I might have a bird's nest in here, but it's very expensive." Men, too, had their own hair-based burdens, although those burdens were significantly less time-consuming and distinctly less life-threatening. A simple dab of pomade, a side part so sharp it could startle livestock, and a moustache elegantly curled to the laws of aerospace physics, these were often enough to achieve an air of credibility. Notably, a gentleman over 40 could be entirely bald and still seen as quite dashing, whereas a woman of similar age was expected, wherever possible, to strategically obscure the passage of time with clever styling and, yes, bonnets. Ah, bonnets. The last step in the hair journey. These came in styles as varied as one could imagine being forced to tie beneath the chin, ranging from delicate lace confections to brimmed creations that required active neck muscles. Bonnets often served a dual function, to frame the face modestly and to signal that the wearer had likely spent 3 hours on her hair, only to hide it under an elaborate head tent. It's worth noting that rain was not considered a charming variable in this coiffure equation. Victorian water infrastructure was still catching up in many cities, so there were few umbrellas and fewer paved streets. On a damp day, a woman's worst nightmare was not losing her handbag or stepping in horse droppings, although both were hazards. It was her painstaking curls dissolving into a frizz so potent it might prompt strangers to hand her a warm compress and a prayer. Despite the labor and pins involved, hair was considered deeply intimate. A woman might offer her beloved a lock of her hair as a token, ideal for being placed in a locket, tucked into a pocketbook, or pinned against one's chest during a mildly overdramatic gaze into the sea. But not all hair was romanticized. For those working in domestic service or industry, hair had to be tied up quickly and practically, often under a cap or scarf, lest it interfere with the serious business of making the upper classes look like they had spent no effort at all. And so, as the morning hours stretched like warm molasses, our Victorian subject, now coiffed, curled, and finally bonneted, stood hair first in the daily battle between effort and illusion. It was nearly time for the next layer of the day's performance, a delicate balancing act between modesty, movement, and muscular memory. The art of walking gracefully in 10 pounds of skirts and a conscience full of social pressure. That, however, is a tale for another moment in this slow, creaky, and utterly charming historical unraveling. There was a certain irony to Victorian morning routines. The aim was to emerge calm, composed, and genteel, yet the process of becoming such a vision required the same level of silence and endurance typically reserved for surviving cholera outbreaks or sitting through your uncle's rendition of green sleeves. By the time one reached the third layer of undergarments, one had already been trussed, laced, shimmied, pinned, buttoned and whispered at solemnly by a maid brandishing an iron spoon to help fasten shoe buttons. The struggle wasn't private either. Dressing, for the upper classes at least, was a team sport involving servants who were both conspirators and gentle tormentors. These women, usually women, could lace a corset using the strength of a horse wrangler, while maintaining the calming smile of someone refilling your tea. And let's pause a moment for corsets. Contrary to popular belief, corsets weren't always devices of medieval punishment disguised as undergarments. Worn properly, they supported posture, shaped garments, and contained the mysterious and often treacherous thing known as internal organs. The problem, really, wasn't the corset itself. It was the arms of fashion marching onward like a stylish cavalry, shrieking, "Smaller, smaller waists," until someone inevitably fainted next to a hedgerow. Young ladies were trained into their corsets, not unlike opera singers or small horses. The process began around age 13 and lasted a decade. By 23, the ideal figure was achieved, but at the cost of being unable to reach high cabinets or breathe near steep inclines. Once the structural fundamentals had been achieved, corset, chemise, drawers, just stockings, tied with garters so snug they could soar through willpower, only then could one engage with the matter of skirts. Ah yes, skirts, the fabric-based topographical marvels of the 1800s. These were less items of clothing and more architectural events. By the mid-century, crinolines had entered the chat. Crinolines resembled collapsible bird cages or inverted satellites. Made from horsehair, linen, or later, spring steel, they held the skirts far from the body like the rings of Saturn, except far more flammable. Indeed, one of the era's lesser-known hazards was the tragic crinoline fire. A lady, brushing too near the fireplace, might go up like a Victorian birthday candle, desperately hoping someone nearby remembered how to stop, drop, and roll. Of course, in many public cases, decorum dictated she do none of those things and instead perish with dignity. This led to a minor trend of adding fire-retardant wool to under petticoats, a quality only slightly diminished, aimed by its overwhelming itchiness. Once the crinoline was on and fluffed to regulation circumference, the upward journey continued. Bodices were next, small, beautifully embroidered tops that frequently fastened up the back, which meant, naturally, that the wearer would need assistance. Then came sleeves, which fluctuated extravagantly with the decade, sometimes ballooning into leg-of-mutton proportions. Not content with just fashion, these sleeves also disguised the upper arms entirely, leaving the entire body's motion range somewhere between wooden doll and trapped badger. By now, one's lady of leisure might be feeling faint, not from actual lack of oxygen, although yes, that was certainly a factor, but from the sheer weight of flourishes, boning, bustles, buttons, bows, and possibly a rogue parasol pouch, depending on the season. Which is why, interestingly, tea was both a beverage and a recovery tool. But alas, we're not done. Pay attention now, for the hat awaits. Victorian hats were less headwear, more personal statements. There were demure bonnets tied with a chin ribbon to make you look like a sentient cupcake. There were wide-brimmed displays of tulle and feathers, designed to say, "I'm single and I brought my own shade." And there were the more adventurous hats, adorned with taxidermied birds, because why not bring your own wilderness to the drawing room? Once the hat was ceremonially fastened, often via hairpins that doubled as defensive weapons, and after the gloves were on and parasol chosen, whether sunny or not, the lady was finally, gloriously dressed. To recap, dressing in the 1800s required assistance, stamina, and occasional risk of conflagration. But if one survived it, there was a brief, ethereal moment where everything was in place. The ribbons lay flat. The laces tugged just so. The parasol was optimistically unneeded, and our Victorian heroine could glide through a salon like a slowly collapsing tent of taffeta. So we resume our gentle voyage through brass hooks and ostrich feathers, just as a knock echoes at the bedroom door. It's the maid again. She's brought the gentleman's cravat, and he's been at it for 45 minutes with no idea which end goes where. The corset, dear listener, was less of a garment and more of a deeply committed relationship, one that pressed, pinched, dictated the terms of breath, and yet was fiercely adored. Let us, with great sympathy and a little giggle, step into the world of the Victorian undergarment that could turn a simple sigh into an aerobic activity. By the 1850s, corsets had already enjoyed a long and very tight history, but Victorians truly elevated the art of self-compression. Of course, few ladies of the upper or even middle classes could dress themselves entirely alone, and so each morning inevitably began not just with tea, but with tugging. Corsets came laced at the back, and tightening them was a two-person job. Ideally, one had a lady's maid. Less ideally, a sister. Least ideally of all, a very determined husband. The goal was simple. Reduce the waist to something barely believable, 18 inches, perhaps even 16, if one had ambition and slight disregard for the location of one's spleen. Now, the corset wasn't supposed to be put on all at once. Oh no. First came the chemise, a sort of linen whisper of a nightgown, designed to protect the corset from the indignity of human skin oils. Then came the corset itself, stiffened with whalebaleen or steel and adorned with embroidery. This ensured that even while one's lungs cried out, one would do so gorgeously. Tightening the corset was an event. One hand on the bedpost, another gripping a sturdy hope. The wearer would brace. The maid would begin the gradual dance of tension and tug, threading the laces across the back, drawing in the fabric with each synchronized pull. Women were taught to train the waist over years, gradually bringing it down inch by inch like a sort of reverse gardening. And yes, there were rumors that women had ribs surgically removed, that their organs wheezed out sad little songs of despair, that fainting couches were less decorative furniture and more a necessary element of structural health support. Some tales were overblown, others perhaps not blown enough. The corset dictated posture. A lady in a proper corset could not slouch, or droop, or really breathe entirely below the clavicle. One was upright and ladylike, correct and careful, because there were simply no other options. Attempting to pick something up off the floor in a corset was equivalent to rehearsing a slow-motion interpretive dance of defeat. Doctors occasionally issued grim pronouncements. There were anatomical drawings. There were early feminist essays with the anatomical drawings. But fashion, as it often does, responded majestically with a shrug and a matching corset cover. Some corsets even came equipped with built-in pouches for scented herbs. Lavender, rose petals, or outright camphor could be tucked in to both freshen the experience and cover the occasional sweaty existential crisis. Men, not to be outdone, had their own version of gentle self-torture, with stays, waistcoats, and cravats so intricately knotted, it's a miracle anyone made it out of the house before dusk. Yet the corset, in all its tightly laced sovereignty, represented more than vanity. In Victorian culture, control of the body was seen as morally upright. A tightly corseted lady appeared disciplined, respectable, contained. Her silhouette was her virtue, engineered. And while we might today view this with alarm and a strong desire for pajama pants, the symbolism of structure and restraint was deeply social. Still, one wonders what whispers passed between women when the stays came off at night. The conspiratorial gasps of relief. The mutual understanding that while society might demand the vase-like figure of a Grecian Umbi statue, it did not have to follow them into dreams. The loosening of the corset laces was, by all accounts, an exquisite moment of exhale. One could finally breathe with one's full lungs, sit without strategizing, and drift toward what Victorians charmingly called repose. But the freedom was fleeting. The corset would wait faithfully on the dress stand, coiled in anticipation of the next morning. Tomorrow's breath would come in inches again. And so, let us gently ease back into our metaphorical fainting couch, corset unfastened, ribs unpinched, and prepare to explore, in due course, the complicated joy of the petticoat, billowing, rustling, and managing to turn a trip downstairs into a theatrical performance of swirling fabric and deliberate descent. In the velvet hush of early Victorian morning, when fog still curled like pipe smoke around the cobblestones and tea had yet to defend its honor against boiled eggs, a strange and noble ritual took center stage: the construction of one's corset. Now, if you're imagining something like slipping into a soft, friendly hug, I must gently redirect your imagination towards something more akin to a firm negotiation with a small ship's rigging. For the Victorian lady, or indeed her devoted lady's maid, the corset was less an accessory and more the architectural foundation upon which her day would be built. Quite literally. You didn't wear your corset so much as you installed it. Made of tightly woven cotton, sprinkled liberally with whalebone or steel, the corset was the era's most elegant trap. One did not simply put it on, one assumed it, like a title or a haunting. There were busks, no, not a typo, which were flat strips of wood or metal slid down the center front to encourage posture that suggested moral fortitude. And the laces in the back. Those weren't embellishments. They were pulley systems for squeezing torsos into shapes dictated by fashion plates and the occasional monarch's whim. The goal, you see, was the wasp waist, about 18 to 22 inches around, which is roughly the circumference of a respectable soup tureen. Now, while most of us might consider breathing to be a daily priority, the Victorian corset respectfully disagreed. It believed, quite firmly, that everything, from lungs to liver, had room to compromise. Women fainted regularly, not always from excitement or the sight of a well-chiseled suitor, but often because their digestive tract had been laced into their ribcage like a reluctant drawer. Naturally, putting on a corset wasn't quick. First, you'd prepare with a chemise and petticoats, because heaven forbid your sensitive ribmeat come into direct contact with your boiling metal hug trademark. Then you'd stand very still while someone, often your maid, and ideally someone not holding unresolved grudges, tightened the laces with a series of graceful but stern tugs, like securing a stubborn sail in a windstorm. This could take 10 to 15 minutes or longer, depending on how much tea one had already consumed and how much forgiveness was in the air. And the sound, the quiet undoing of breath, the creak of whalebone, the occasional whispered curse in the Queen's English. It was like a symphony in D minor, the key of despair. But let us not be unfair. Women of the time, many of them, loved their corsets. They spoke of the support they offered, the feeling of readiness they inspired, like cloaking oneself in elegance stiffened with industrial ambition. Some women even slept in lightweight versions to train the waist, a phrase that implies the waist is a dog that might eventually sit when commanded. And corsets weren't limited to grand dames in drawing rooms. Working women, maids, shopgirls, governesses wore them too, though typically with fewer frills and greater urgency. Imagine scrubbing a floor while your sternum is being coaxed into a new postcode. That's real multitasking. The very best corsets were bespoke, stitched by skilled hands that understood both engineering and anatomy. A fine corset maker could gently measure your bust, underbust, waist, and hip with the gravitas of a cartographer taking down the dimensions of a newly discovered island. In some cases, corsets were even padded to smooth over irregular topography, as one lady's manual delicately put it. It's worth noting that not all women were laced within an inch of their spleens. Much depended on class, occasion, and personal tolerance for lightheadedness. And while cartoons of the era sometimes exaggerated the practice until people looked like hourglasses caught in violent wind tunnels, most corseting was moderate by modern shapewear standards. Not comfortable, perhaps, but not a daily death sentence either. Still, the question lingers. Why all this effort? Why compress your liver and ferment your spleen with such meticulous resolve? The answer, dear listener, lies partly in the e-social calculus of the time. If clothing was a language, the corset was Victorian grammar, unyielding, complex, and prone to causing headaches if you misused it. The silhouette it created argued persuasively about one's virtue, status, and desirable marriageability. There was something almost poetic, if exhausting, in that daily performance of refinement. And so, with corsets cinched into place and organs politely relocated, it was finally time to venture onward, to skirts, bustles, gloves, and more. Because if history teaches us anything, it's that we are forever putting ourselves together just to be noticed, approved of, or at least not sent back upstairs to change. But let's linger just a little longer with the corset, with its paradox of elegance and imprisonment, a whispering echo of the era's grand deception, that beauty is ease, when in fact it is often effort hidden under hooks and laces. Now, as we tiptoe deeper into the layers of Victorian attire, we must next explore something puffier, stranger, and unmistakably impressive. The morning light in a Victorian dressing room was very polite. It crept in shyly through lace-draped windows, hesitating to startle the houseplants or awaken great-grandmother's portrait, which frowned perennially from its spot above the mantel. A charcoal fire crackled with the tired sound of someone resigning themselves to the day ahead. Everything in the room was buttoned, cinched, and tied, except for the human being in it who had just rung for assistance. This brings us gently to the lady's maid. Now, in the grand pageant of Victorian domestic staffing, ladies' maids were among the most indispensable and also among the most long-suffering. They were personal assistants before that was glamorous. Think of them as the early prototype of the iPhone. If the iPhone could lace your corset, manage your hair, remove grass stains from silk, and do it all without sighing too audibly. When the lady of the house stirred in her cotton nightgown, one that somehow still had ribbons and 15 buttons, the maid would arrive with a can of warm water and a sense of grim serenity. "Shall we begin, ma'am?" she might say, as if they were about to jointly land a hot air balloon in a crosswind. First came the chemise, which sounds romantic and ethereal until you discover it's essentially a linen sack with delusions of grandeur. Its purpose was to keep the actual dress from touching one's actual skin, because, heavens, skin oils. Cleanliness, in the modern sense, was still catching on at this point in history, and clothes were often better cared for than humans. If the chemise was a declaration of prudence, the next layer was a manifesto. The corset. Ah, the corset. A torturous whisper of elegance, as if the garment itself were saying, "Let's keep all this inside." Constructed with whalebone, metal eyelets, and stern Victorian intentions, the corset was not something one simply put on. No, it was an experience. A duet, really. A sort of slow, gasping waltz between the corset, the woman, and the maid with ominously strong hands. Maid. "Breathe in, ma'am." Lady. Gasp, maid. "Now don't." The tightness was not optional. It was a living sculpture in real time. Corsets could reduce a waist to what was then seen as an alluring circumference, somewhere between elegant hourglass and just enough room for one lung. But elegance is pain, darling, and collagen damage, and occasional organ displacement. Once the corset was fastened, which is to say, once the poor woman had agreed to defy physics for the sake of fashion, petticoats followed. Petticoats were the unsung symphony beneath every fashionable dress. Multiple layers of them rustled like whispered secrets from the past. They were starched, stitched, hooped, sometimes quilted, often itchy, and always necessary. If you did not wear enough petticoats, society would accuse you of shapelessness, an unthinkable offense. With chemise, corset, and petticoats in place, we were now merely halfway to clothed. The outer gown was an architectural achievement in itself, constructed with boning, panels, bodices, and heartbreak. Mid-19th century gowns often featured crinolines, which were starched or steel-caged underskirts designed to expand the dress into a bell shape. Walking through doorways, Sitting down or existing near lit candles while wearing one was considered hazardous but chic. Then came sleeves, sometimes removable, sometimes voluminous, often baffling. Evening sleeves differed from midday ones. One needed eyes on the clock and a full-length mirror to keep things dignified. Finally, accessories arrived like late guests at a very overdressed party. Gloves were necessary, even indoors, even in May, even while drinking tea with someone you hated. Brooches pinned things that didn't need pinning. Chatelaines hung jingling from waists, featuring tiny scissors, sewing kits, pencil stubs, and other objects of domestic might. Jewelry sparkled modestly, though never before 11 a.m. That would be vulgar. A hat might follow, or a bonnet or a veil, depending on whether one was marrying, mourning, or merely promenading near shrubbery. And there it was. A woman swaddled in 6 or 7 layers of expectation, now prepared to sit very properly in the parlor and write letters with sentences so polite they could barely express emotions at all. Her spine straight, breaths shallow but fashionably so. All of this, of course, took effort, endurance, and the unwavering help of someone trained to fasten 17 buttons in under a minute while offering no moral judgments. And that's where the lady's maid came in. With a quiet nod, she retreated, likely to iron the next round of petticoats and whisper a prayer of thanks that she didn't have to wear the bleeding things. As you settle deeper into your pillow, picture those slow, precise mornings, the hiss of the fire, the creak of tight lacing, the soft swish of skirts passing by on worn floorboards, and imagine what it was like to start every day inside a wearable cage of social expectation, or, as Victorians called it, something becoming. And as for what came next once one was finally dressed, well, it involved tea, decorum, and rather a lot of fainting couches. But that's a tale worth dreaming through. In the hushed elegance of a Victorian morning, the bustle of getting dressed was not the frenzied, coffee-stained madness of today, but instead a sort of drawn-out theatrical production with multiple acts, several costume changes, and at least one strategically placed fainting. Everything began with the underthings, of course, that most dignified collection of garments designed to swaddle a body not in comfort, but in an elaborate game of Edwardian Jenga. First, the chemise, a lightweight, usually white shift of linen or cotton meant to protect your corset, ironically, from you. A fine idea, given the corset's hostile tendencies and your ribcage's fragile optimism. The corset itself was next. We've skirted around it thus far, but no longer. It is time to meet the true diva of the Victorian wardrobe. Not merely an undergarment, but a force of architectural ambition. Made of tightly woven fabric stiffened with whalebone steel, or, if you were the extra extravagant sort, ivory. The corset praised your internal organs by politely squishing them wherever they shouldn't be. Contrary to popular imagery, most corsets were not cinched down to breathless, wasp-waisted oblivion, though some certainly tried. A modest lady might tighten hers only enough to smooth the figure. But let us be honest, modesty was not the prevailing theme. Waist reduction was competitive, and corset advertising positively glittered with promises of miraculous inches lost and posture gained. A fashionable Victorian woman might emerge, looking like she'd just borrowed her torso from a cello. Once bolted into this corporal cage, one proceeded with some semblance of bravery to the next layer. The crinoline, or later, the bustle. The crinoline, born in the mid-1800s, was basically the love child of a hula hoop and an ambitious birdcage. Steel rings of increasing diameters were sewn together to form a wearable lampshade. This was worn under the petticoat to transform the modest figure into an elegant terrain of skirted enormity. One might sweep the room before entering it. By the 1870s, silhouettes shifted again, and in came the bustle, a smaller contraption, but still sturdy enough to qualify as light scaffolding. It shoved the posterior into polite society with a kind of rearguard enthusiasm. There were wire bustles, padded bustles, collapsible bustles for travel, essentially anything short of a drawbridge. Next came layers of petticoats, not simply for warmth, though they did kindly trap summer's heat until September, but to add fullness, weight, and that satisfying sense that you were perpetually teetering on the edge of fabric-based disaster. With all of these interior preparations settled, hopefully without injury, the outer layers could begin. A day dress, often 2 pieces, was worn like elegant armor. Long fitted sleeves, a high collar, and a cascade of fastenings that seemed determined to test your dexterity. Buttons made their appearance here in vast, multiplying legions, each smaller and more infuriating than the last. You'd almost think the Victorians were in a conspiracy with button makers. If you were dressing for walking, there was a walking suit, tailored, substantial, with perhaps a velvet-trimmed jacket and matching skirt. For the less ambulatory engagements, tea, for example, or peering wistfully at the rain, one might don a day gown of lighter materials, festooned with pleats, ribbons, or a few tokens of lace, so delicately placed it seemed the very act of sewing them had required a whisper. There were, of course, numerous accessories. Gloves were utterly essential. A lady would no more go out with bare hands than she would with bare ankles. A modest hat perched like a feathered thesis statement atop a coiled mane of elaborate hair. Jewelry was not to be flashy. No, that was for actresses and Americans. Instead, one might pin on a sweet little brooch, carved perhaps into the shape of a weeping willow or someone's lost dog. Elegance, you see, was nothing without a hint of melancholic symbolism. All of this, mind you, took time. Not minutes, hours. And not solitary hours. Dressing oneself in full Victorian regalia was like assembling a ship in a bottle using only your elbows. You needed help. A lady's maid, welcomely competent and generally more stoic than average marble statues. She snapped, tugged, and laced with the practiced intensity of someone who knew you'd faint before breakfast if she got the corset slightly wrong. And then, of course, you were dressed. At last. Upright, faintly breathless, draped in 20 pounds of fabric, you floated down the stairs like a magnificently repressed soufflé, wholly prepared for a day of modest gesturing and ceremonial sighing. But if daytime dressing was an orchestration of polite struggle, nighttime dressing, changing into what passed for nightwear, was a ritual of even stranger fashion decisions, involving dressing gowns, nightcaps, and the fierce integrity of a good flannel. We'll ease into that next, as we drift ever deeper into the folds of these unraveling yards of history. By now, you are well acquainted with the Victorian passion for excruciatingly complex garments and systems of human ornamentation. But let us drift into a quiet chamber of the era, where the accessories whispered their importance with the rustle of silk and the clink of a jet bead. Tonight, we nestle into the curious world of Victorian morning routines, specifically the accessories cabinet, also known as the place where time went to die. The accessories cabinet was not so much a piece of furniture as a shrine to detail. A Victorian lady didn't merely get dressed, she was assembled like a particularly delicate piece of mechanical clockwork. And each accessory was both decoration and obligation. Take gloves, for instance. Preferably kid leather, which sounds faintly adorable until one remembers it refers to the skin of very young goats. Soft, yes. Ethically uncomplicated. Well, this was the Victorian era. Empires were built on less. A respectable woman owned dozens of pairs in myriad shades of pearl, biscuit, dove, and other colors that sound like they came from an artisanal bread menu. They were not simply for warmth. They were meant to conceal the hands, which, despite their usefulness, were considered scandalously hand-like. Putting them on was its own gentle torment. First, one had to powder the hands, lest they be too damp, with, heaven forfend, actual human moisture, and then gently ease each finger into place. tight-fitting gloves were a sign of refinement. The tighter, the better, really, even if it meant briefly wondering whether your ring finger might lose circulation entirely and just tap out. Once gloved, you'd move on, perhaps to the brooch collection. A single brooch might contain a miniature painting, grandma's preserved hair, and, mysteriously, a live moth. All real possibilities. Mourning brooches were especially popular, often housing tiny curls of a deceased loved one's hair, woven with all the somber drama of a silent film score. But while brooches pinned morality to one's bosom, fans were the fluttering secret language of flirtation. A lady could communicate entire sentences with the flick of a fan. For instance, slowly running it along the chin meant, "I desire your acquaintance," while fanning quickly might say, "I am displeased," or possibly, "There's a wasp in my bonnet, and I'm not fully clothed yet." These subtle signals made fans the ultimate cross between a telegram and a performance art piece, held together with ribbon and lace. Parasols, meanwhile, were not to be confused with umbrellas, heavens no. Parasols were delicate and embroidered with lace, made for warding off the sun rather than rain, which, as we've previously murmured, would simply destroy everything anyway. A parasol completed the look, offered dainty shade, and reinforced the idea that having a suntan was deeply unfashionable and perhaps morally suspect. You see, a tan suggested you spent time outdoors doing things, which suggested labor, which suggested lower class, and in a cruel, ironic twist, the Victorians would sacrifice all vitamin D just to maintain the luminous pallor of the consumptive elite. Purses. Or rather, reticules. These tiny handbags resembled nothing so much as ornamental coin purses with aspirations. They were often crocheted, beaded or embroidered, with floral motifs and secretly unable to hold anything more than a hanky, and perhaps an anxiety or two. Anything larger might damage the silhouette. You understand? Where did women keep all their belongings? Likely with a servant. Or not at all. Self-sufficiency was not part of the aesthetic. Even jewelry wasn't frivolous. Lockets held locks of baby hair, mini daguerreotypes, or smuggled romantic notes folded into microscopic squares. Jet jewelry was worn only in mourning, ivory was in, and cameos were very in. Decorated with the profile of some Roman lady who may never have existed, and certainly wouldn't have approved of being strangled by a velvet ribbon twice a week. And naturally, no stroll through accessories is complete without mentioning the garters. These were ribbons or bands used to hold up stockings, often embroidered with secret messages from a suitor or newlywed husband. Romantic and deeply impractical, much like wearing a three-piece dinner ensemble just to walk through your own garden. The process of choosing the right gloves, fastening the brooch, aligning the parasol, arranging the reticule, and checking one's fan, just in case an opportunity for coded communication arose, was exhausting, and somehow none of these things could be done by candlelight, which meant starting the day early, laboriously, and VERE-CELLO-WL. And still, after all that fiddling, pinning and lacing, they had not yet left the dressing room. But they were close. Next came the indispensable help of someone who, lest we forget, did all these things for someone else, probably wearing half as much and worrying 3 times more. Yes, enter the long-suffering lady's maid, who deserves her own spotlight, however faintly lit. That flickering candle just might guide us there. As the gas lamps flickered to life in the sitting rooms of England, another evening began, and with it came the slow, creaking ritual of removing everything one had spent the entire morning wrestling onto oneself. Victorian undressing was a ceremony all its own, a soft unraveling of the day's expectations, and surprisingly, a team sport. While the upper crust had the luxury of ladies' maids and valets, helping untangle them from the architectural engineering projects they wore as clothing, the less fortunate performed private acts of disrobing, not unlike desperate solo performances of interpretive ribbon dance. There were hooks to unfasten, strings to unlace, buttons as small as remorse to contend with, many of which were situated somewhere inconvenient, such as one's exact dorsal spine. One could not simply slip out of a dress or loosen a tie. Oh no. Each layer had its exit strategy, and each exit strategy required an advanced degree in garment removal or a lifelong friendship with a helpful cousin. Let's walk through just one evening retreat to comfort for a hypothetical young Victorian lady of good standing who has, let's say, endured yet another long afternoon of moral rectitude and moderate diarrhea. She returns to her bedroom where her lady's maid, possibly named Edie or Mildred, there were only about 6 names back then, awaits with a hairbrush and a knowing smile. First, the outermost dress. By this time, it feels like the weight of colonial obligation. The day dress, containing approximately 14 fastenings, 5 pleats, and 2 secrets, is unhooked with strategic grace. This may take between 10 and 17 minutes, depending on whether the bodice is boned with actual steel or metaphorical steel. Once that's hoisted off, beneath we find the corset, still clinging to the ribs like an overbearing aunt at a family reunion. Laced with so much thread it could double as nautical rigging, the corset requires deft untying. It also requires the wearer to stay perfectly still, lest the whole thing snap open like a mousetrap. The moment a corset came off was a glorious thing. Visions swam, lungs expanded, ribs groaned their gratitude. Some women described it as taking off your bones. Others simply sighed and sank into the chaise longue like half-cooked puddings. Then came the petticoats, plural. These were the colourful onion layers of the feminine setup. A well-dressed Victorian woman might sport 3 or 7 at once, enough to start a minor tent city if she wished to flee the premises. Petticoats had to be carefully lifted over the head or stepped out of, always with grace, ideally not tripping over the chamber pot. Below even that lay chemises and drawers, undergarments that were both intimate and ironically roomy. For some reason, these were often crotchless, not as a fashionable statement, but as a practical approach to Victorian plumbing, which mostly didn't exist. The Victorians loved modesty so much, they wore 4 underlayers, but also had shockingly little fabric in the places one might assume mattered. Meanwhile, the stockings, long, scratchy, friends of the shin, were yanked slowly down and often reattached to a drying rack where they hung like forlorn caterpillars, hoping someday to emerge as comfortable socks. Evening toilette, the official term for this disrobing ritual, didn't end with clothes. Hair took center stage. A proper lady's curls, once meticulously ironed, pinned, puffed, and prayed over, now needed detangling. This required careful brushing with boar bristle brushes and quite a bit of trust that the maid wouldn't stage a rebellion with each tug. Hairpins multiplied during the day and were now removed in a process not unlike foraging for small metal artifacts in tall grass. They'd be plucked out, one by one, vanished into a little porcelain dish, like secrets into a wishing well. Then, finally, into the nightgown. Soft cotton, usually hand-stitched, often with a ruffled neckline so grand it looked like you were being slowly swallowed by chiffon. Some resembled ghost attire. Others had the demure gravitas of a baptismal robe sewn in tragic memory of comfort. Once inside her sleepwear, our fictional Victorian heroine could at last do something nearly scandalous. Sit down. With her spine less compressed and organs returned to their customary latitude, she might sip a bit of weak tea, read a few lines of a novel her cousin claimed wasn't trash, and listen faintly to the creaking of the house as family members across London removed pounds of fabric and centuries of oppressive tailoring from their weary persons. Some called it preparation for bed. Others knew the truth. It was liberation disguised as lace. And just as the last candle flickers behind its glass shade, we turn toward what came next, how the night, even in its softness, was yet another performance in the daily theatre of Victorian life. There comes a point in the Victorian dressing process when one begins to suspect that the garments are not entirely created for the sake of warmth or modesty, or even modest pretension, but out of a secret, unspoken competition, a kind of social Jenga, where the player who stacks the most restrictive, inexplicably shaped clothing elements without toppling over wins an invitation to dinner with someone titled the Honourable. This brings us to the bustle. Yes, the bustle. A word that sounds like a frolicsome verb. She bustled cheerfully about the drawing room. But in the 1870s, it was a noun. A formidable noun. A noun that could carry half a tea tray of pastries on it if you steadied yourself well enough. The bustle was a structural contraption worn beneath a woman's skirt, designed quite literally to lift and enhance the posterior area. Think of it as the architectural cousin of the crinoline, except instead of expanding in all compass directions like a fashionable satellite dish, it localized its enthusiasm to the rear half, creating a silhouette that said, "I may or may not be smuggling a decorative footstool back there." Bustles came in various styles. Some little more than padded rolls tied around the waist, others elaborate wire cages resembling a very confident bird who had taken up residence under your skirts. These were fastened around the waist, over layers of petticoats beneath the outer skirt, and often doubled as a surprising source of breeze on an otherwise stifling afternoon. It was a matter of fashion geometry. The flat front emphasized the roundness of the back, creating the favorable profile known in polite society as fashionable deportment, and in less polite whispers as wagon-loaded. One must remember, no elastic, no Velcro, no stretch fabrics. Attaching the bustle was a vastly delicate operation involving tapes, strings, hooks, strategically chosen prayers, and, if needed, a sister or maid holding the back of your corset like she was launching a lifeboat. And it couldn't be just any bustle. Oh no, the fashion changed almost annually. The early bustles of the 1860s were the puffy and pillowy. Then came the 1870s cuirass bodice and its narrow floor-length proportions, briefly shoving the bustle out of vogue and forcing it to loiter awkwardly in the back of the closet like a rejected soufflé. But then, triumphantly, it returned in the 1880s, grander and brazier than ever. The shelf bustle, as it was fondly dubbed, sat out from the waist like a small side table, large enough to support perhaps a doily or a melancholic house cat. Now, consider daily life with this curious appendage. Picture trying to sit, for instance. One couldn't so much lower oneself into a chair as hover delicately and then wait for gravity and soft fabric to sort things out. Standing up again might require a hand on the armrest, the knees of moderate cooperation, and the quiet resignation of someone who's been held slightly captive by upholstery. But why go to all this effort? Because every wrinkle, every fold meant something. Social class, marital status, wealth. And in an age where women were largely barred from speaking in parliament or owning much, the art of announcing things with one's derrière had its own kind of power. There were criticisms, naturally. Satirical comics showed women balancing tea sets on their bustles, while clergymen tutted about vanity and danger. But the women knew. They knew that beneath all the fabric, wires, tapes, and puffery, the bustle was a declaration, an identity pinned and puffed into place. And in a quietly rebellious way, it was fun. A little bit absurd. A sock in the eye to drabness. The bustle said, no matter how grey the fog outside may be, or how stiff the collar of one's escort, you, madam, may carry an entire exaggerated hillscape on your rear, and no one shall dare say a disapproving word, provided your hem is at regulation ankle length. Some women even kept letters or small notes in the humbler bustles. One frugal woman of Leicester was known to tuck her knitting needles there. Unorthodox, perhaps, but practical. Besides, a bustle could act as a pretty convincing travelling pillow on especially long train rides, provided you didn't mind looking like a napping camel. And so, another layer was added, another step. The world turned a little more sideways to accommodate fashion's whimsy, and the women of the age continued the daily armistice with physics. Soon, we shall slide into yet another peculiar fastening of Victorian rigmarole, the curious world of gloves and the 17-minute handshake. But for now, let the silhouette rest. as the Victorian sun lazily spilled through lace-curtained windows, filtered to a hazy golden blur by layers of London soot and early industrial optimism, another daily trial was set to begin: the arrangement of hair. A ritual so delicate, so fiercely misunderstood by modern sensibilities, that to simply call it doing your hair would be like calling the building of the Great Pyramid a bit of light landscaping. To understand the full spectacle of Victorian hairstyling, one must first consider that this was an era when a woman's virtue, status, and likelihood of being invited to tea could all be determined by the volume, sheen, and architectural stability of the hair bundled atop her head. Forget dry shampoo. Forget casual ponytails. This was the age of the hair rat. Now, before you imagine a rodent lounging on someone's scalp with a pince-nez and copy of Mrs. Beeton's household tips, let's clarify. A hair rat was a little bun of your own hair, collected from your hairbrush and carefully shaped into a soft, fluffy, donut-like structure. These were used to pad and poof one's coiffure into dizzying volumes of majesty. It was essentially Victorian recycling. Instead of tossing those precious strands in the bin, you stuffed them into little muslin pouches and kept grooming until you had enough for a modest topknot or architectural hair arch that could support a small tea service. Hair wasn't washed daily or even weekly. In fact, cleansing the scalp too often with soap and water was frowned upon, unless one had aspirations of catching a chill and being dramatically taken to one's fainting couch. Instead, women dressed their hair. This involved brushing it, not timidly, but with 100 firm, sequential strokes in the evening to redistribute natural oils, eliminate tangles, and remind the scalp who was boss. Brushing, of course, was done with precisely the kind of brush that today would be labeled heritage craftsmanship and cost a sensible fortune. Ideally, one made of boar bristles and bound with ivory, ebony, or mother of pearl, because if you were going to risk wrist strain, you might as well do it elegantly. After that, a variety of unguents and pomades would be applied, bearing names like macassar oil or bandoline. The former, a tropical concoction of coconut oils and sometimes rum, imparted an unforgettable slickness and fragrance. The latter resembled sticky wallpaper paste and was known for gluing stray hairs into submission. But beware the side effects. Macassar oil was rebellious, leaving greasy smears on antimacassars, those dainty lace doilies draped over furniture precisely to defend upholstery from scandalous scalp residue. In the morning, the layering began. Hair was parted with severe precision and then twisted, padded, looped, and pinned into shapes ranging from modest buns to the soaring Grecian arrangements that dared to defy gravity, time, and common sense. Tiny steel pins were used in such quantities that the average Victorian woman could set off a carriage magnet at 5 paces, and the pins, much like opinions on Darwin, were sharp. Ladies' maids became secret artists during this process, deftly braiding, coiling, and combing every lock with near-military focus. A good maid could weave hair into rosettes, swirls, and barley twists without ever once losing her composure. A truly great maid could listen to gossip at the same time. Headdresses came next: combs, ribbons, miniature bonnets, or the ever-daring ostrich feather, all fastened atop already towering hair, like the cherry on a particularly earnest cake. And if a hairpiece was needed due to thin hair, scandalous hair loss, or just the desire to impress the vicar, well, that was arranged before breakfast. Men, of course, did their own share of preening. Pomades were just as popular in the gentlemen's washstands, and moustaches were brushed, waxed, and shaped with the reverence modern humans might reserve for bonsai trees. Sideburns, too, were cultivated with particular attention, sprouting like polite topiary down either side of the face. In the world of dreams, where time liquefies and patience stretches out like a cat in the sun, one might almost see the poetry in it all. A society so obsessively coiffed that even a wisp of stray hair was a social statement. The Victorians didn't just wear their beliefs, they arranged them. tampered them, and held them together with pins and a prayer. Soon, we'll drift deeper into the rituals of accessories, those final battlefield decisions of brooch versus chatelaine, gloves versus muff, parasol versus sunburn, as we continue wandering through the delightful clutter of a time when simply getting out the door required a moral compass and 4 hands. Wind curled softly around the edge of the lace-curtained windows, just as it may have done in the drawing rooms of 1879, when society was thriving, corsets were tightening, and peace was frequently disrupted by the shriek of an ill-fitted crinoline hoop catching on a doorframe. Now we arrive at the curious institution of the Victorian dressing bell. You see, in the stiff-laced architecture of upper-class life, even the act of getting dressed had developed a social protocol, not entirely unlike the etiquette of a formal dinner, except with more poking rods and less soup. For those fortunate, or perhaps unfortunate, enough to be members of the upper classes, the day began not with the sound of birdsong, but with the delicate tinkling of a small handbell rung imperiously from the bed. This summoned one's lady's maid or valet, depending on whether you were a finely coiffed heiress with a penchant for powdered rice powder, or a gentleman mainly concerned with waxed moustaches and monocles that otherwise had no clear practical purpose. The arrival of the dressing servant began something that was, frankly, more theatre than utility. Consider, if you will, that the typical Victorian woman of means changed clothes no fewer than 5 times a day. Morning dress was modest, practical, meant for staying indoors and not alarming the staff. Then followed a promenade dress, suitable for walking slowly and looking generally unbothered by anything physical. After that, a luncheon dress, an afternoon visiting dress, and finally dinner attire, which was formal and often involved additional underwiring, swan-like neck posture, and the emotional support of close friends. The dressing ritual was elaborate and precisely ordered, an architectural feat of fashion engineering. Layers were applied like geological strata. Chemise first, a soft, if shapeless, underlayer to keep more expensive fabrics free from the body's more human realities. Then drawers, not quite underwear in our modern sense, but rather leg tubes connected by a string waistband, open at the middle for reasons that are as inconvenient as they sound. Next, the corset. Ah yes, the corset. The Gothic cathedral of garments, constructed with steel boning capable of encouraging fainting at any breath above whisper-level enthusiasm. Despite some modern myths, daily wear didn't necessarily result in organ failure, but the discomfort was real, and tight lacing contests among young debutantes made at least one liver write a stern letter of resignation. The corset was yanked, fastened, adjusted, and then yanked again, while the wearer generally held onto a bedpost and recited whatever social grace one might offer while being laced into a ribcage vice. Then came bustle pads, which were small, tied-on cushions meant to give the illusion of, shall we say, a more geographically ambitious backside. These were followed by a petticoat or several, often starched within an inch of their lifespans, and finally, the gown itself, which might button up the back in such a way that a woman left alone would need either magical powers or a mild haunting to get dressed on her own. A gentleman was less layered, but not free from suffering. Morning dress involved shirt studs, a cravat, which required knowledge of at least 3 obscure knots, waistcoats with button counts that fluctuated according to fashion's whims, and trousers buttoned high enough to challenge the line between solemnity and indigestion. Jackets were tailored within millimeters of breathing capacity, and top hats were required for all ventures more than 3 steps from home. Interestingly, in this sartorial theatre, the outcome was not solely about fashion, but about moral character. A slouched corset could suggest impropriety, a misaligned necktie might hint at a loose moral compass, and heaven help the person whose gloves showed signs of being worn more than once without washing. Cleanliness in this rigid order was very close to acceptability, which meant that dress wasn't just fabric, but fabric assigned a deep, judgmental symbolism. And just when you thought you might sneak into a more comfortable pair of slippers and call it a day, the day's wardrobe was only just beginning. But perhaps now, with the wind whispering past one tall window pane and the distant murmuring of ladies' boots pacing the drawing room rug, you can rest easy, knowing you didn't live in a time when underwear involved 6 people, a system of pulleys, and at least one fainting couch. Let us drift on, gentle listener, toward what awaited just beyond the wardrobe: grooming. A ritual of oils, hot irons, shaving brushes, and pomades scented vaguely of elderflower and existential dread. As the afternoon sun cast gold-threaded lattices through heavy velvet curtains, our Victorian striver was finally emerging from the outfit equivalent of a small civil war, only to face yet another sartorial battle: accessories. You might think by now that such details would be optional. A feather here, a button there. But oh no, dear listener. In Victorian times, accessorizing was not garnish. It was a sacred ritual worthy of its own Downton Abbey subplot. Let's begin with gloves, those delicate emblems of civilization and complete impracticality. One did not simply wear gloves. No, one possessed gloves, treated them like small white diplomatic envoys, and attempted to navigate daily life without creasing them, tearing them, or dipping them into soup. Gloves were key indicators of social status because nothing says, "I don't labor for a living," like perfectly pristine lambskin wrapped around your hands. And removing gloves, that required etiquette so intricate it bordered on opera. Thumb, thumb, finger, finger, elegantly tugged without ever exposing one's wrist. Heaven forbid the gentlefolk witness a knuckle. Now, if you were a gentleman preparing for an evening's outing, you'd also be fiddling with a pocket watch, not to check the time, heavens no, but to simply clip its gilded chain into the most charismatic angle possible from your waistcoat. The watch itself could remain unfunctional. No matter. The point was to look as though you might be about to duel someone if their train ran late. Ladies, meanwhile, had reticules, tiny handbags the size of a generous teabag. These were permitted to contain exactly one handkerchief, one calling card, and perhaps a tightly folded sigh. If you needed anything practical, money, say, or smelling salts, after discovering your corset made breathing optional, you'd just have to hope your maid had a satchel the size of a steamer trunk, or perhaps you had a helpful cousin named Gregory who could be relied upon to carry things and not ask questions. And then, dear heart, we come to hats. The Victorian hat was not mere head covering. It was your personal thesis statement, a doctoral dissertation made of felt, straw, and rage. If you were lucky, your hat was simply absurdly large and pinned to your coiffed head with approximately 400 steel needles pointing directly at your cerebellum. Unlucky. You had inherited trends like taxidermied birds perched atop your scalp, or decorative cabbage roses the size of a small breakfast table. Hatpins were sold by the inch, and used both to secure your headwear and, potentially, to defend your virtue. A really determined spinster could probably take down a footpad with a well-aimed jab of her millinery weapon. It's said that respectable young ladies were told to avoid wearing aggressive hatpins lest they seem capable of masculine independence, which is Victorian for terrifying. For those feeling rakish or poetic, lorgnettes, those tiny spectacles on sticks, were a must. Not because you needed them, necessarily, but because peering at people with a glinting monocle-like contraption suggested that you were interesting and possibly French. Even the way you opened your lorgnette said something. A quick flick said, urbane and irritated, while a slow, theatrical unfolding said, I may faint from ennui. Bring me grapes. For the finishing touch, a dab of scent. Not perfume as we now imagine it, the light spritz whispering of citrus or sea breeze, but powerful concoctions made of musk, violet, and something vaguely alchemical. Some Victorian perfumes were so potent they could stun a horse, which is ironic, since horses also scented London liberally. But in truth, perfume did double duty. First, to signal fashion and affluence. But second, and far more pragmatically, perfume helped mask the general Victorian aroma. After all, laundry day was an Olympic sport, and someone might have gone an entire week without encountering soap. And so, at last, our fashionable friend, laced, buttoned, gloved, belted, scented, and stabbed through with a modest bouquet of hatpins, stood perched like an elaborate cake topper, ready to enter society. And by enter society, we mean sit disapprovingly on a tufted settee while sipping tepid tea and pretending not to be mildly concussed by her own ensemble. But before she could descend the grand staircase, there was still one more hurdle to clear. A creature known to cause more drama in Victorian homes than gossip or gaslight. The shoe. Ah yes, the next ordeal would begin from the ground up. There is no rush in a Victorian morning. Not because people were relaxed. Heavens no. It's just that once you've devoted the better part of an hour to coaxing your legs into stockings that bind like a gentle feud, and another to wrestling your arms through layers of chemise and corset while trying not to dislocate anything important, haste becomes a forgotten concept, like privacy or functional buttons. Inside the quiet, lamplit bedrooms of the upper and unequally served classes, the ritual of dressing continued into its final, triumphant stages. The outer garments, layer upon layer of intentionally difficult fashion that said, "I don't do manual labor, and I shall perish before you think I do." Let us begin with the walking dress, an outfit so noble and unreasonably floral that even strolling 2 blocks felt like a chess match with gravity. For a woman, this dress came with its own internal infrastructure, including detachable sleeves, frilled overskirts, and usually a petticoat or two, as if layering meant safety. This was not so much an outfit as a garmented onion of social expectation. Ladies might appear delicately composed, drifting through London's parks like satin ghosts. But underneath it all, they were bundled like particularly stylish loaves of bread, lightly toasted, tightly trussed, and filled with the quiet fury of someone aware they'll need a full 20 minutes and a maid to use the loo. Now, should the day involve an afternoon call, an activity with the thrilling stakes of high tea and no actual tea in sight, a costume change was expected. Not optional in the polite world, where being seen in your walking dress at 4 p.m. was social self-immolation. One's calling attire would be slightly less dramatic in structure and slightly more dramatic in embroidery. Sleeves ideal for knocking over vases accidentally on purpose. Bodices so stiff with boning and ambition that one could barely curtsy without sounding like creaking furniture. Meanwhile, Victorian gentlemen had their own slow chaos to endure. A proper middle-class man dressed like someone preparing for both a duel and a dinner. First, the shirt, starched within an inch of its existence, with a collar so sharply upright, one could store family grievances inside it. Trousers were high-waisted enough to confuse the anatomy. Then came the waistcoat, or often waistcoats, because layering your anxieties was a unisex sport. And finally, the frock coat, cut to suggest that the wearer had very firm opinions about colonizing things and very soft feelings about sideburns. The Victorian necktie, or cravat, required not only dexterity, but a patient understanding of nautical knots. Tied correctly, it expressed confidence and refinement. Tied poorly, it expressed that perhaps one was a poet and liable to go mad on Tuesdays. Even shoes weren't safe from overachievement. Ladies' boots buttoned up the side, requiring a special hook tool to latch each pearl-sized button through each minuscule hole. Gentlemen's polished leather footwear was so narrow it's believed some men considered the agony a sign of moral us in character. If it didn't hurt to walk, were you even virtuous? By mid-morning, both genders were fully outfitted in victory and invisible suffering, standing beneath ceilings painted with cherubs, sipping tepid tea through clenched jaws and trying not to pass out from mild compression. They stood, floated, and tottered with the kind of grace only achievable when one's spine is resting against the steel foundation of a corset or the emotional weight of a monocle. To be well dressed was to be admired, but also vaguely shellacked. Real comfort was for servants and libertines. That is not to say there weren't attempts at innovation. Some women sewed secret pockets into their skirts, only to find them entirely full of handkerchiefs, smelling salts, and the occasional letter they'd forgotten to post. Men dabbled in suspenders and elastic garters, the shocking technology of it setting entire drawing rooms abuzz. One young man's elastic suspenders snapped during a game of backgammon and required a full week of whispered scandal to settle. But while the world outside changed by rail and telegram, the world of fashion within the drawing room carried on with the determined flamboyance of a flamingo negotiating a top hat. And with the ceremonial dressing now complete, and the hour almost suitable for polite appearances, our well-layered subjects of empire and etiquette, cravat and corsetry, could finally begin their day, properly swaddled and faintly gasping. Which brings us gently to the subject of afternoon repose, a time neither productive nor restful, but just possibly a little less vertical, midway through the Victorian evening routine. After the endless layers, the whalebone implements, and the miniature battles fought in silence with flesh-toned stockings, our weary subject faced one of the most curiously stressful rituals of the day: hair. Ah, Victorian hair. A sprawling ambition of waves, coils, loops, and on special occasions, full-scale architectural projects. For women, one's hair was not merely a decorative afterthought. Rather, it was a social calling card, moral descriptor, and, judging by some of the more elaborate updos, a possible perch for passing songbirds. Let us begin with the length. Victorian women were expected, nay morally obligated, to have long hair. Short hair, unless you were recovering from a fever or possibly social disgrace, was viewed with mild horror. In fact, it wasn't uncommon for a woman's hair to be so long that she could sit on it, though doing so might accidentally yank her head backward, a hazard no one mentioned in etiquette manuals. Hair was washed infrequently, not for lack of hygiene, but because Victorian shampooing was a form of domestic hydrological warfare. The average wash might occur once a month, and even then, with homemade concoctions involving eggs, castile soap, and in some cases, gin. Not drinking gin, just vigorously massaging it into the scalp, though one imagines some multitasked. Between washings, women kept their scalps tidy, with a combination of boar bristle brushes and unshakable optimism. Brushing was recommended 200 times a day. Yes, that's 200 individual strokes. If this sounds exhausting, that's because it was. One popular beauty guide referred to it as a meditative exercise, which is charming if you have, say, 3 hours and no fires to stoke, starving babies to feed, or corsets to readjust. Now, once the hair was deemed satisfactory for public consumption, and by public, we mostly mean the judgmental gaze of neighbors who could see it peeking out from under your bonnet, the styling could begin. This involved an array of devices resembling medieval torture instruments. Curling irons had to be heated near open flames, which meant every hairstyle was also a potential insurance risk. Many a maid was known to have scorched her charge's hairline into a crisp Gothic fringe, and some women allegedly turned to wigs out of relatable trauma. Speaking of which, enter the finest unsung heroes of Victorian tresses, the hair rats. These were not actual rodents, though one can never be entirely certain with the Victorians. No, hair rats were little mesh bundles of a lady's own fallen hair, collected diligently from brushes and combs, because who wouldn't want to gather their shed follicles into delightful puffs to stuff back into their chignons? These rats were used to add volume underneath the hair, allowing for the dramatic domes and swoops you see in portraits. The logic was simple. Why not recycle what your scalp gave up willingly? A kind of hair-based upcycling that makes modern composting seem emotionally distant. Gentlemen's grooming, by comparison, was brisk, bordering on sparse. A man might brush his moustache, perhaps oil it with a product that cheerfully doubled as furniture polish, and then declare himself ready to be perceived. But women? They might spend upwards of an hour arranging their locks into a kind of fibrous layer cake, complete with side ringlets that looked like curly parentheses whispering secrets to the rest of the head. And as with so many things in Victorian fashion, help was not only appreciated, it was downright essential. Styling one's own hair to the standards of society was considered bold, a touch brash, and likely doomed to failure, much like attempting a solo waltz or challenging the Queen to arm wrestling. Thus, enter the maid with nimble fingers and a wooden box full of hairpins, ribbons, and likely personal opinions. She would pull and twist and braid, silently judging Susanna's misbehaving temple curls or Ophelia's asymmetrical fringe. By the end, she would step back with the quiet pride of an architect inspecting the final arch. Imagine the poor soul who had to sleep in these styles. And no, they didn't all take their hair down each night. Some, having secured the perfect coiffure, would do anything to preserve it for the following day, including sleeping bolt upright or arranging pillows like structural scaffolding. So there you are. Your dress is fastened, your corset committed to its mission of internal compression, your shoes mercifully buttoned after a 15-minute wrestling match, and atop your splendidly encased spine rises a triumph of curls, rats, and at least 3 combs carved from tortoiseshell and high expectations. And still, the evening hasn't even begun. Next, we drift into the delicate world of social calls and parlor rituals, where gossip was furnished with doilies, and even sitting down had an etiquette manual. The sun had not so much risen as politely tiptoed into the parlor, trying not to trip over the lace antimacassars. And there, seated in a faint blur of morning light and tepid tea steam, was our weary Victorian gentleman. He had finally managed to attach all his cuffs to the correct wrists, a feat he achieved only after a small existential crisis and a brief conversation with the family butler about the nature of buttons. But now, dear listener, we turn our gaze to one final, and rather curious, garment in his daily assembly: the cravat. Ah yes, the cravat, the polysyllabic cousin of the modern necktie and the spiritual ancestor of every YouTube tutorial involving silk and frustration. This was no slapdash ribbon hastily wrapped around a weary neck. It was a statement, a declaration, a symbol of a man's refinement, wealth, and ability to spend 20 minutes in front of a mirror without crying. The Victorian cravat was not content to merely exist. No, it was to be folded, tied, puffed, and secured in elaborate knots with names like the waterfall, the mathematical, the ballroom tragedy, and, most feared of all, the oriental knot, which looked nothing like its name and everything like a swan that had been startled mid-pas de bourrée. Printed manuals were available to guide the gentleman through this labyrinth of neckwear. The Art of Tying the Cravat, written in 1828, wasn't satire, though it reads like it might have been written by a man aggressively not okay. It featured 32 unique methods of binding a square of cloth to one's gullet, and presented them without irony or mercy. Imagine needing a diagram to strangle yourself fashionably before breakfast. With his cravat finally fastened, after 3 false starts and the dejected removal of 2 pearl-headed pins, the gentleman was nearly ready to show himself to the world. His valet presented a mirror. He looked horribly dashing. Not because the cravat flattered him, but because wearing it had aged him 50 years. Let us not forget the other side of the collar, though. Clothes, after all, are equal opportunity tormentors. For Victorian ladies, the collar and neckwear situation was arguably even more complex. Collars were detachable and often starched within an inch of their lives, contributing to the widespread epidemic of what we might call very proper neck rash. The feminine cravat variant, such as the jabot, was a frothy cascade of ruffles that communicated the eloquent message: yes, I am drowning in lace, and no, I cannot turn my head to the left. Jabots were often pinned into place with brooches that could double as small shields, protective and decorative. Victorian ladies, after all, were experts in using jewelry as defense mechanisms. A sharp hairpin or two and an impressively reinforced brooch could fend off both lecherous suitors and sudden gusts of wind. Necklines, meanwhile, were an art form in themselves. Morning dresses had high necks and long sleeves, fit for weeding, journaling, or brooding dramatically near a window. Evening gowns, by contrast, plunged daringly toward the collarbone, allowing a bit of décolletage to peek out in scandalous defiance of the 10 layers surrounding it. The juxtaposition gave the effect of a single, brave square inch of flesh waving a tiny flag for freedom. And let's not neglect the finishing touches, scent and accessories. For the gents, a touch of eau de cologne, perhaps made of bergamot and despair, sealed with a lavender note. For the ladies, a dab of rosewater perfume, symbolizing both elegance and imminent sinus irritation. To walk down the street, fully dressed in the Victorian era, was not just a matter of covering oneself modestly with cloth. It was, in essence, performance art. Each pleat, each ruffle, each filigreed boothook was a tiny act in the grand theatre of society, and the role each person played was one of non-stop sartorial endurance. Our gentleman now stood at the doorway, gloves immaculately buttoned, hat perched at the mathematically ideal angle, his cravat whispering tales of dignified suffering. He squared his shoulders, faced the cobblestones with a sigh of quiet dignity, and stepped beyond the threshold. And as he disappeared into the misty bustle of the avenue, somewhere indoors, another soul was already facing down their own greatest daily adversary, the corset. But that, dear dreamer, is a tale we'll fasten tightly. Next, as twilight softened the gaslit streets of Victorian London, and the last stubborn maid finished polishing the last stubborn candlestick, the true melodrama of Victorian life was only just beginning. In the drawing rooms, the parlours, and more perilously, the dressing rooms. We arrive now at what our corseted protagonists feared most: social outings. And by outings, we mean orchestrated theatres of wealth where one's attire wasn't just decorative, it was a declaration of moral superiority. Now imagine this. You've suffered a 2-hour morning corset lacing ceremony, battled with 19 fastenings on your petticoat, and you've already had a tiny faint just for fun. But just as you perch yourself daintily by the fire with your embroidery slab and a mild case of oxygen, deprivation, comes the call. You're invited to Lady Farnsworth's evening soiree. Cue the rising dread. Evening wear in the Victorian age wasn't merely a fresh dress, it was an architectural challenge. Day dresses, with their modest necklines and conservative sleeves, were suddenly scandalously démodé after 6 p.m. Now came the off-the-shoulder gowns, the kind that swooped dramatically but clung so tightly you could barely reach the salt if it sat more than 5 inches from your wrist. First layer, the chemise, fresh, a little hopeful, followed by the corset again. Because heaven forbid you recycle a morning corset for an evening affair. No, the evening corset was shorter and tighter, literally engineered to push the bosom heavenward and send your spleen on holidays. Over that, something called the corsage bodice, which is not nearly as flirty as it sounds, was zippered, buttoned, or in some merciless cases, laced directly into your will to live. It ended at your ribs, and the skirts would balloon out from there as if preparing to smuggle small furniture. Ladies rarely dressed alone, unless they had the prehensile reach of a gibbon. One needed a lady's maid, an agile, sharp-fingered woman, part ninja, part engineer, to navigate the labyrinth of hooks, ties, buttons, and tapes. Lacing up a dress could take 30 minutes. Undoing it could take 15, or a small pair of sewing scissors and a whispered promise never to wear it again. Shoes were delicately heeled, inflexibly narrow, and designed by people who clearly had no interest in either comfort or walking. The silk stockings were stitched carefully, and because the hemline of one's gown might momentarily reveal an ankle, it had to be flawless. Flawless ankle, flawless stocking, and absolutely no evidence of sweat, fatigue, or the crushing knowledge that you might be out until 3 a.m. sipping lukewarm consommé. Gentlemen, for their part, didn't escape the madness. No, indeed. For them, Evening wear required a strict adherence to the tuxedo system, which, like most Victorian systems, was equal parts rulebook and potential misdemeanor. Shirts had high-starched collars that were so stiff one had to tilt the chin permanently upward, giving everyone the look of a proud, slightly overwhelmed crane. The bow tie, tied by hand, often badly. The waistcoat, worn firmly and confidently, despite being roughly 1 tablespoon of gravy, away from never buttoning again. And heaven help you if your tailcoat didn't sit just so over your bustle-free bottom. Every item, every stitch, every perfectly shined patent shoe told the world, I am extremely wealthy, extremely uncomfortable, and possibly made of wax. But the most notable and invisible part of any outfit was the posture. Victorian elegance depended on standing as though one had swallowed a ceremonial rod, and seated as though one's spine had ambitions of legendary straightness. Slouching was for house cats and artistic types. You, dear viewer, must balance an entire fruit bowl atop your head, or at least look like you could. Now, once attired and perfumed, the final ordeal was transport. Climbing into a carriage required strategy, not to mention spatial awareness, since evening wear tended to have roughly the mass and circumference of the British Empire itself. You could not simply get in a carriage. You had to be folded, puffed, and fluff managed. Often servants were employed just to stuff petticoats after you. And then, at long last, you arrived. Gliding into the perfumed salon, fan in hand, shoes whispering across parquet, you smiled with the weary elegance of someone who had fought 17 separate textiles and won. For the moment. Because naturally the real question still hung in the air, like rose-scented doom. How on earth would you get out of it all at the end of the night? I suppose we'll tackle that little problem next. By the time our Victorian ensemble was finally fully layered, laced, boned, buttoned, bustled and bowed, one would be forgiven for assuming the day's work was already done. And in fact, for many dressers it was. A morning spent wrangling 17 pieces of clothing onto a body not designed for such architectural demands could leave both the wearers and their attendants in dire need of a sit-down and something involving heavy starch and afternoon tea. Let's take one final misty-eyed look around this elegantly inconvenient world of Victorian dressing, with all its oddities, obligations, and endless layers of implausibility masquerading as fashion. First, there was the hat, or rather, the ceremonial crowning of one's head with an elaborately feathered, flowered, and occasionally taxidermied spectacle that made modern millinery look like an act of public service. Some hats of the era were so wide they required doorframe negotiations, and others sat atop the head with the balance of a circus. Performer carrying 3 porcelain teacups and half a pheasant. Attached to this, quite often, was a hat pin. Ostensibly a simple tool to anchor one's hat to one's coiffure, the hatpin doubled as both an unsolicited weapon and a symbol of unexpectedly fierce Victorian feminism. You see, fashionable women wandering the foggy city alone occasionally took to jabbing unsavory onlookers with their hatpins. The press clutched pearls, Parliament debated lengths. But the hatpin remained, long and unapologetic. Then, of course, there were the gloves. Ah, gloves. The unsung heroes of modesty and minor inconvenience. In an age when shaking hands without gloves was a form of flirtation, or perhaps a misdemeanor, they were as essential as oxygen. A true Victorian lady owned gloves for morning, noon, evening, and insultingly specific shades of church-going. Removing them in public was tantamount to scandal. Losing one could launch a subplot in a Jane Austen novel. Around the waist, one might find a chatelaine, a delightful piece of domestic jewelry that dangled keys, scissors, and other household tools like a sensible Swiss army belt of the manor-born. Though it sounds vaguely like a medieval weapon, the chatelaine was a status symbol among housekeepers and ladies of the house, a key to command over linen closets, guest lists, and silently fearful maids. And once all the clothing had been fastened and fastidiously examined by multiple humans and small mirrors, There was the matter of movement. Movement, you see, was not a guarantee. It was more of a possibility. If the outfit allowed it, Victorian women's clothing had all the alacrity of a cathedral. Sitting, walking, or, heaven forbid, climbing stairs were events to be planned, timed, and possibly supervised. Men, by this point, were clomping about in frock coats, button boots, and enough pomade to render a small sheep waterproof. Their collars, starched into architectural marvels, might pinch the ears or, more dangerously, decapitate a sneeze. It was fashion as endurance sport, competing not with each other, but with gravity, weather, and common sense. Yet, despite, perhaps because of, these trials, getting dressed in the Victorian era was a ritual saturated with meaning. To don these garments was to enter the world as a character. Your corset whispered your class. Your cuffs told others what tea time meant to you. Your bustle shouted statements about your taste, your wealth, your seamstress, and how many doorways you'd recently had to walk sideways through. And beneath it all, under the starch and stays, was a real person, often longing for simpler seams. Though they outwardly honored the absurdities of fashion's strict etiquette, one suspects they also managed to roll their eyes behind velvet curtains. Somewhere deep down under those 12 layers of petticoat and protocol, they yearned, as many of us do, for comfort, simplicity, and perhaps the silent freedom of a drawstring waist. And now, as we gently pull back from the candle-lit dressing rooms and the perfumed boudoir, the faint rustle of layered fabric grows soft, like autumn leaves settling after a breeze. The whistles of distant trains and gas lamps dim remind us that even the most complicated of outfits were meant at the end of the day to be unlaced. The buttons have been undone. The corset lies folded. The hat, its feathers slightly askew, rests on its perch. And you, dear listener, are free to recline, not in a crinoline or a bustle, thank goodness, but in the sweet, forgiving comfort of your softest pajamas, or perhaps nothing at all, if today has truly pushed Victorian patience to its limits. So nestle in, much freer than your ancestors ever were at bedtime, and close your eyes to the quiet hum of history. Good night.